human resources is a helping profession. You're resourcing humans to do their jobs well, and jobs are a huge part of our lives. Some people will look at, for instance, pay transparency and just see it as a legal compliance issue. And it's not. It's a lot more than that. So our pay transparency laws here, you're required to post the salary range for a job opening. If you're working at a business that has now done that and you see that open role and see it's the same one you're in and they're getting more pay, you're going to be like, what's going on? So that's why I tell people pay transparency is way more than legal compliance. It's really a trust building action.
Today's episode of the HR L&D Podcast is sponsored by Deal. Now, take a moment, if you would, to consider the following pre-show scenario. Imagine you had to visit 16 houses just to cook your dinner. One place has the pots, another has the pans, another has the stove, and another has the food. You get the idea. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, the reality is most global businesses operate exactly the same way, using 16 different tools and platforms to hire, manage, and pay their workforce. But now there's one platform that does it all, and that's today's sponsor. That's Deal. That's DEEL. And Deal is the all-in-one platform built for global work. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, from automated onboarding to performance assessments and beyond, you can manage the entire worker lifecycle all under one roof. Hire and onboard talent in over 150 countries, or run payroll in over 100 countries. Even offer competitive benefits, equity, and equipment. With Deal's industry-leading suite of HR tools, payroll solutions, and compliance services, you can scale globally with unmatched speed and expertise. So are you ready to transform your global HR system? If you are, click in the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deal today. That's DEEL. Welcome back to the HR L&D Podcast. My name is Nick Day. I'm CEO at JGA Recruitment Group. We are specialist HR recruiters operating across the globe in the UK, EMEA, and the USA now as well. And of course, if you are a lover of this show, please do remember to subscribe to it. If you haven't yet, please do review it. But most importantly, if you can share this episode or one of these episodes with any of your HR colleagues and friends, then together we can really raise the profile of human resources and people management for everybody worldwide. And someone who's going to really help us do that today is Sally Loftis, who joins me today on the HR L&D podcast. She's a real champion of pay equity and transparency, something we have covered before on the show, but never perhaps to this detail, particularly on the equity side. So we'll jump into that. Sally is from Loftis Partners LLC, and she has a rich background in human resources strategy and a passion for fostering equitable workplaces. Today, she's going to bring her expertise to us on today's show to really talk about how pay equity and transparency is really starting to translate in today's HR landscape, how we can really build trust through transparent pay conversations. She is the managing director at Loftis Partners LLC, which are a 100% women-owned human resources consulting firm located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. And Loftis Partners specialize in strategy, people, facilitation, and of course, pay justice. For those not in the know, Sally also serves as a faculty member for the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities, and she's the lead consultant for two justice-driven consulting firms. One of those is Wayfinding Partners in Washington, D.C., and the other is Brook Graham of London, England. She's also a certified Appreciative Inquiry Facilitator. So without further ado, let's welcome Sally Loftis to the HR L&D podcast, and let's take a deep dive into pay equity. Sally, how are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Nick. Thank you for the introduction. I feel like I want you to follow me wherever I go and introduce me before I go in. That was so enthusiastic and amazing. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, actually, what I will be doing, definitely, if you are interested in what we talk about today, I will definitely be putting some of Sally's links. You can follow Sally directly instead if you're interested in finding more about pay equity. Before we jump into that, let me ask my first question, which I ask all of my guests, which is this: what do the words human resources mean to you?
I love this question, and I know that a lot of guests say that, but for me, human resources, I've been in human resources for the last 30 years, and I got into it because I feel like human resources is a helping profession, and you're resourcing humans to do their jobs well, and jobs are a huge part of our lives, and so to me, it's resourcing the humans, even though some of those resources may be non-human, right? So technology, things like that, which is why it's really important for human resources people to be involved in the strategic conversations within a business. So I love the term human resources because really working in that space to resource humans to do incredible work.
Yeah, fantastic. What a great start. And I fully agree. We want to get HR professionals fully involved in those strategic conversations. And something we're finding a lot more coming to the forefront now in terms of those strategic conversations is all around pay equity. And that's a space that you work extensively within. So I wondered if you could just bring that to life for our listeners a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what pay equity is, but also why it's really important.
Yeah, I will start with just kind of a definition because there are a lot of people talking about pay equity right now. Actually, if you go on TikTok, you can spend hours learning about that. But I will say, so I use pay equity as an umbrella term, and meaning that it kind of covers things. There's a lot of things under the umbrella that fall under it. So equal pay, pay transparency, cost of living, cost of labor. Obviously equitable pay practices. And so pay equity is about making sure people have equal opportunities to receive pay based on what they're bringing into the organization, that also promote equity in a way within the organization, realizing that people come with different needs and there's going to be different resources to get them to that equitable place.
Yeah, fantastic. Why is it really important we're talking about this now? I think I would argue, being this side of the water, that this is probably a little bit more of a hot topic subject for the US because you have slightly different, well, I think you're further ahead than us, really. I know from a recruitment perspective, we can ask different questions to our candidates in the UK than we can in the US. It'd be against the law for me to, for example, ask what somebody is earning in many states, whereas in the UK, we're not quite there yet. I suspect that will come in the UK in due course. But tell us a little bit why this is really a hot topic, certainly stateside, but why we should also be thinking about it in a broader context globally, because this is really starting to pick up some pace.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you say that. You think like in England, y'all are ahead, I think maybe in some ways, but then also y'all have had, pay gap reporting for several years, and we don't have that in the United States. There's certainly some, proposals coming forward to do that. And you might find that more like in government work here in the United States. So what we're seeing in the United States are definitely more conversations about pay equity and pay transparency. And so pay equity is important because it's one of the ways that you're going to retain employees. And if you're doing pay equity well, you're going to be having conversations about pay and, demystifying pay. And that's going to eventually build trust. I shouldn't say eventually, like it does it off the bat, build trust with your employees, which is so crucial right now. Just what was it like last year or first quarter of this year, it was the lowest employee engagement numbers that Gallup has ever tracked. So it's important to be engaging your employees around things that matter to them. And pay is huge right now, especially in the last 5 years with the cost of living adjustments. People waking up to cost of living. It was an issue before the pandemic, but all of a sudden people are like, noticing that there's an issue. In the United States, we've had a lot of wage stagnation, which is why pay has been lower. So it's really a conversation that people are having. And if organizations aren't having it, they're going to fall behind and not be able to retain their talent.
Yeah, I agree. Retention of talent is a topic that's close to my heart. We talk about a lot on this show because, of course, my background is recruitment, and we talk a lot about our employees and building an EVP and an employer value proposition, which, of course, pay equity has such a central role within that as well. But we also need to be careful and mindful of it, really, from a legal perspective. And you mentioned sort of pay gap reporting here in the UK, which actually you're absolutely right. We have that here. Of course, it's not for all businesses. I believe it's business over 250 employees. I'm going to have to sense check that. But from a legal perspective, why is it such a big legal topic at the moment?
Well, for us, I will say in the United States, because it's linked to transparency. And so, some people will look at, for instance, pay transparency and just see it as a legal compliance issue. And it's not. It's a lot more than that, right? So I use the couple of examples of, like, for instance, if you're now required, so our pay transparency laws here are typically you're required to post the salary range for a job opening in a role. And if you're working at a business that has now done that and you see that open role and see it's the same one you're in, and they're getting more pay, you're going to be like, what's going on? Like, I don't understand. There's an inequity there. So that's why I tell people pay transparency is way more than legal compliance. It's really a trust building action and helping people understand that, you want that employee in your business to understand what's going on before you're posting that range. And pay transparency is more just, kind of opening up what the opportunities are. We're not quite to the point, I think, in the United States where we're doing kind of that gap reporting, which I would love. And that's easy for me to say because I'm not running a big business, but, is bringing accountability to organizations to decrease the pay gaps, to decrease, the lack of inclusive practices. So it's really systemic interventions into the business to open up conversations about pay, which is connected to everything in the employee experience.
I've got a couple of questions on this. And this is going to be my recruitment hat on here. And I don't know, maybe this is quite contentious. We'll wait and see. Certainly one of my biggest bugbears in the UK is companies putting adverts out without salaries. I think it's misleading. It wastes everyone's time. I had my brother-in-law recently went for an interview. It's a great example. When he went for the interview, it went really well. And then later he discovered that actually the salary on offer was way below what he'd be looking for. Didn't find out till second stage. And that's just wastes everybody's time, right? So I can see why that's really frustrating. I can also understand from the perspective if we are legally obliged in the US to advertise our salaries, why that may potentially frustrate employees if we're in the same role. However, this is a controversial bit. I have my recruitment hat on. For me to recruit somebody for an organization, I want to recruit the best talent, the best industry talent. Typically, the best industry talent, I would argue, is passive. It's the candidates that don't know they're looking for a job until I come across them and say, hey, if you thought about this client, they're on your doorstep, they do this is the EVP, they're amazing. And they say yes, but the chances are that individual is already going to be on the salary scale of a peer. So in order for me to be able to tempt them out, we need to have a scale that sometimes is more competitive than what some will already be earning. And that's why, and all the studies will show, sometimes the quickest way to a salary increase is actually to change jobs because people will pay more in order to compete and to get the best talent. So it's not always that when you see an advertising a higher salary, it's not always to say that they value the role or it's different. It's just that you've sometimes got to pay more to get the best talent in. But herein lies the trouble, right? How do we manage that? I guess the answer would be if you recruit higher, then you've got to raise the bar for everyone at that level. And that's obviously more costly from a client perspective. But I do think it's something we need to try and navigate. And I'm wondering if that's why we're seeing such broad salary ranges now. Because sometimes, yes, in the US, and we operate in the US, I'll see clients advertise a salary, but it'll be from, the range is so big now, it's kind of almost pointless even having it on there. I'm wondering if that's why we're seeing.
Yeah. I love the detail of this question, so thank you. So yeah, to give you an example, famous one, I think it was Netflix posted a job in New York City and the range was 90,000 to 900,000, right? So, that's like ridiculous. It's just comical. So yeah, from a recruiting standpoint, yes. So a couple of things. One, I want to come back to the recruiting piece. And then two is the internal piece. Yes, I work with organizations. So a lot of people are experiencing salary compression right now. And that's because a lot of organizations have moved their frontline people up in pay, and they've moved their senior people up to retain them in a really, difficult season in the world. And so a lot of people in the middle are not experiencing that same those same increases. And so that's whenever people start jumping, right? People start jumping because they're like, I can't grow here. I've got to go somewhere else. And to your point, on average, you're going to get 3% more pay jumping at least than staying. And so, it's really important for an organization to understand that pay is all, it's almost like a spider web, which I hate to use because I hate spiders, but, like this web that, this living system that you're constantly managing. And when you do, to your point, you kind of pull that lever to get new talent that is going to impact the system. The important part for a business, to me, is to build flexibility in that lever. So for instance, like usually I'll work with organizations to build like new pay grids and things like that. And then we'll talk about, do you want to have, maybe an option to offer 10% more or 20% more because maybe somebody lives in a really high cost of living area. Maybe they're coming, crossing sectors. and you need to get them in, to your point, really talented, really hot job out there, right? Businesses need to have that flexibility to get those hires, but it needs to be kind of within that total ecosystem of pay, so it doesn't throw everybody else off. I've seen a lot of organizations do what I call whack-a-mole. Do you know what that is? It's like this game at carnivals. Yeah, in the United States, and it's like these series of holes, and there's moles that pop up, and you have this big hammer,
Sure.
Yeah, whack them down. And that's kind of what I use that analogy, because that's kind of what a lot of groups have done. Like a lot of businesses have done is they've just been like, I got to hire people because there's a shortage. People are leaving, and they've kind of done this whack-a-mole with compensation and are now dealing with a lot of issues. So I say all that to say, yes, I think there should be some kind of flexibility in your piece to go after and get the talent you want and need without throwing your whole pay system off.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with the way you put that. I think the answer from my perspective, and I'm biased, but this is much easier, it makes my job much easier, is if a client gets this right, they get the EVP right from the outset. Yes, it's going to cost you front end because you've got to probably pay everybody in your business slightly above average, potentially. But it pays dividends in the retention piece, number one, because you don't lose them for those 3% changes. And number two, it makes my job way easier to find you good talent because I don't have to, break your pay structures to get them in. You're already breaking your, the average pay structures as it is. So it's a much easier sell for me. But of course, I understand from a corporate perspective, that can be an expensive decision, but I think it pays dividends later on. Of course, this isn't just about job posting. And I don't want to just people to think that pay equity is just about jobs we're seeing out there. So tell me a little bit more about how it goes. Pay equity goes beyond just what's being advertised as a job salary. It's, it is a big legal topic at the moment. What else do we need to consider?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are really 4 phases in the pay equity implementation that I work with. And so those 4 phases are preparation, assessment, leadership buy-in, and then implementation. And so I tell people preparing. So let's look at phase 1, preparing. And to your point, why is it important? So there's a lot of us who are going through, and I will say every organization probably needs to be having this conversation right now, that needs to update our internal assumptions about people. Right? The things we thought about employees are different than what we thought 5 years ago. And our systems and structures reflect what we were doing 5 years ago, more than likely, or, may have elements of the new world we're in. So it's really important for people to go in and kind of assess what's going on. So the preparation piece is really understanding, where are your employees located? What are maybe some of the things they're dealing with? So for instance, I'll give you an example. Does somebody live in a childcare desert and they're having to pay, $2,000 a month for childcare because that's the only provider in town. So what's, could we, what is it that person's dealing with, and, kind of things like that. Not saying that's the organization's responsibility, but I'm just saying it's understanding your employees, hearing their feedback. I'll tell people pay equity starts and ends with employees. It's got to be employee centric. Then it's going through and assessing and really looking at your pay data and being like, okay, what have we done? Where are we? And looking at it by different demographic identities. And to your point, tenure is one of those that I work with groups on, because there's so often, and this in the recruiting space, there is so much money left on the table and that we don't account for in our budgets whenever somebody leaves an organization. So typically people are, just looking at what does it cost, to post this job, maybe hire a recruiter, things like that. But really you're looking at a loss of productivity in your organization. So I would be interested, Nick, to kind of hear from you, like how quickly, let's say it takes somebody 60 days to get a person to the new job, and then another 2 to 3 months to get them up to full speed. Well, that's 4 or 5 months of lost work and lost impact on your bottom line, right? So, but we don't look at that money because we absorb it.
I think the studies that we look at here in terms of the cost of a poor hire, which I know is a slightly different metric, but if you consider the lost time it takes in interviewing, the lost time it takes in training, not just the financial investment of posting an advert or paying a recruiter, but a lot of this is about, as you say, time and productivity. They average it out about 5 times the annual salary. So the cost of a poor hire can be very expensive. Now, if we think about this from a different context and the way that you were positioning it, people often don't invest in that tenure piece, but actually the cost of losing that individual who has long tenure is usually that it's much cheaper to actually retain them and pay them correctly, or whatever you need to do to retain them, than it is to let them walk out the door and go through the whole process of re-recruiting. Now, of course, it depends. That is an individual case-by-case basis. There may be reasons why you'd like that person to go and you want to replace it. But what I do know is, as you say, it can be a very expensive exercise. And you could find a replacement, but you have no guarantee that replacement's even going to work out. They fit in your culture. There's a whole swathe of other things to consider. So I think you're absolutely right. Ultimately, it can be very expensive to recruit. Even that's an industry I know very well, and I'm in that industry. And we can find people quickly, but we're still a commercial enterprise, and there's a cost to that.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, and those are the kinds of things, it takes kind of a strategic mindset to think about that. And so often when we're replacing people, businesses can be in reactive mode. They're just like, I got to get somebody, in as soon as possible. But how it relates to pay equity is just thinking about sometimes, people will be like, we don't have money to raise, pay, we don't have blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, you have a 40% turnover. So let's talk about that. What would happen if you could, turn that in half? And there's money out there, right? To your point, it's cheaper to retain somebody than to hire somebody. But because we don't keep that stuff on our books, financial books, we don't look at it, but that's a much more strategic conversation and intervention with talent than just being like, well, kind of being reactive all the time. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess there's an economy of scale element here that I hadn't considered before. But yes, it's cheaper to retain than replace. But of course, if you're thinking from a pay equity perspective, if you've got to raise the bar for 100 employees because that one individual's got more elsewhere, then actually maybe it's cheaper to let them go and replace. So I think there's probably two sides to that coin for sure. It's an interesting way to think about it. I think the thing that came to my mind, you mentioned at the start the word location. And now, of course, the world of work now, we can recruit people. We don't have to be domestic. It doesn't have to be in our country. We can recruit people all over the globe, different states, different costs of living in the US. Certainly in the UK, it costs more to live in London than it does in Scotland. It even less to live somewhere like Bulgaria or wherever it might be. So how does that impact pay equity? The idea now that we can engage a remote distributed workforce, often much more cheaply, much more cost effectively. Hello, HR and people leaders. Are you exhausted of the war for talent cliche? The problem is when we hear a cliche, it usually exists for a reason. However, we think it's time for a fresh approach to the talent crisis. That's because at JGA Recruitment, we understand the real challenges you face in sourcing phenomenal HR and people candidates. And guess what? We think we have the solution. Our team is on a mission to revolutionize your hiring process. That's because we're not just recruiters. We're strategic partners dedicated to finding HR and people professionals who align perfectly with your company's vision and goals. So let's break the cycle of frustration together. Partner your talent acquisition strategies with JGA Recruitment and experience the difference in service, excellence, and results. No longer do you need to suffer the costs associated with a poor hire, because with over 100 five-star Google reviews and already trusted by many of the world's leading brands, why don't you take action today? Contact us at jgarecruitment.com to discover how we can help transform your HR and people teams. And here's a bonus. When you visit us, you can sign up for our weekly HR newsletter that's packed with invaluable industry insights and more. Let's revolutionize your HR talent acquisition strategies together and make the war for talent a cry from the past. Visit jjrecruitment.com to find out more.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that question, because that's where my headspace has been for the last month. I mean, it's been something on my mind for years, but kind of this concept of global pay, right? Are there global pay scales? Which would mean, you have an organization, you have people all over the world. And for instance, does your executive team that may manage people across continents have some kind of global pay scale? And what does that mean? I think, to your point, and I'll use the United States as an example, we have 56 states, territories, and jurisdictional councils here. And you have 56 different experiences across the United States of where you are, because our states, we have a federal minimum wage, but our states also have leverage over increasing those. So you could live in so for instance, California has, it's gotten a lot of press lately because the McDonald's workers, got raised to $20 an hour, not just McDonald's, but fast food workers, to $20 an hour. And so if I'm sitting in North Carolina where I live, where it's definitely cheaper cost of living, I'm thinking, oh, from a business perspective, you're like, where am I employing people? But from an employee perspective, you're like, why am I not getting paid $20 an hour if they're getting paid, out in there? So those are a couple of examples, but to pull up again and have that strategic conversation, a business needs to really think about, how are you going to deal with location? As someone who's worked internally in HR, the thought of paying people based on each individual location where they are makes me kind of want to cry, because that would be a nightmare to keep up with. There are certainly people who do that, right? So I've seen a lot of groups who maybe will do regions. Maybe you live on the West Coast of the United States, and, you may have people who work in England and, things like that, because there's also different laws that dictate, right?
And different tax levels, even in the States as well, right? You could pay 100,000 will go further in one state, maybe North Carolina, they might do in New York, because the tax system's different. So it's a real minefield.
Absolutely. It's kind of, yeah. I mean, and I've worked with a group in South Africa, and I'm like, the things that you've got to provide there are very different. So, really, you've got to kind of pull up and have the strategic conversation, about what are we going to do? And as you're growing, so, do we want to hire people, right, in other areas? A lot of people, like with hybrid work, are starting to, maybe say, we're going to, you can work from home 3 days a week, but you got to come into the office 2 days a week. So that means you got to live within 100 miles of the organization. I give all these examples to say there's a lot of flavors that you can choose, in doing location work, but you've got to sit down and have a strategic conversation as a leadership group and make some decisions about that, because that's going to guide how you do the work. So to your point, we talked about earlier, like it may be, hey, we know we're hiring this person out of, San Francisco, which has one of the highest cost of living in the United States. And we've based all of our stuff on, Chicago or whatever. So the biggest thing is people have got to pull up and have those conversations and make decisions. A lot of clients I work with will, choose the headquarters if they still have office headquarters, but, headquarters space, and be like, that's going to be our determining factor. And then again, one of those flexibility levers, like we talked about, maybe like we're willing to go up 10 or 20% if people are in these other regions. I feel like I just threw out a whole bunch of stuff to you. Does that all make sense?
No, it's all been well received. It all makes total sense for me. So, and we've got into some detail, which is great. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be thankful for the strategic element that you've highlighted. If we starting to get this right, then how are organizations starting to build trust through pay conversations? I know it's a lot of work that you've done. I know you can probably lead on some case studies, but trust is a really key conversation turner at the minute, right? Everyone's talking about transparency, not just in the world of pay, but in the world of DEI and inclusion and belonging and other things as well. All of those terms ultimately come around the world of trust. I've had Stephen Covey on the show talking about trusting and inspiring a workforce and what that can mean for people. So I want to bring that into the pay equity conversation. How can we use pay equity to help build more trust with our employees to really build that engagement?
Great framing. I will say, yeah, absolutely. Trust is huge because it's a key component of employee engagement. So thinking about on the recruiting side, right? If somebody's out looking for a job, I will tell you, so I'm in my late 40s. So I don't even know what generation I'm in, Gen X. But people younger than me, I think sometimes they have the same, viewpoint of me. So if I go look at a job and there's not a range posted, I automatically in my head think, what are they trying to cover up?
Yeah, I agree.
What are they trying? What's going on? Yeah. So that before they've even engaged with you, right? Somebody, a candidate is forming an opinion of you. So to say on the recruiting standpoint, the pay equity piece is a trust building action, because if you can come out of the gate with just saying, this is what this pays, this is why we pay the way we do. That's another thing that people is really helpful, is to be able to be like, hey, here's our compensation philosophy, and here's kind of how our pay grids are structured, whatever. Being able to have a conversation and explain to people, this is why we pay the way we do, builds trust, right? Because you're willing to have that conversation, and it builds transparency. So go on through, so into the, let's say somebody who's in the organization, whenever you're having those pay equity discussions, one is you're demystifying a topic that people only talk about whenever everybody else is not in the room, right? People are talking about how much they get paid. But, I'll do focus groups with organizations and I'll ask, what pay conversations are happening within your team? And people will be like, this is the first time I've ever talked about pay out loud at work, except in my annual performance review. So, there's a level of demystifying and making it, normalizing that we can talk about pay, that we have kind of a structured process for people to increase pay, grow with our organization, and that there's just a lot less mystery, which then again, people trust because they're like, oh, they're hearing their thoughts, right, in what's being communicated to them of like, they know I want to know this information. And so they're giving it to me. So that's a trust building action. And that's why pay equity starts and ends with employees, because you've got to listen to your employees and build structures and practices that reflect what they have shared with you, and then implement it, and then give them an opportunity to review and discuss with you.
Yeah, I love that response. I think there's a few things that kind of come to mind when we talk about some of the elements that you raised there. I think one you mentioned, it can be a difficult conversation, and sometimes you think, hey, what's wrong with that business? Most humans have an inherent negativity bias anyway. So if it's not there, my first thought is, even as a recruiter who works in this space, it's probably a low salary. It's probably low. If you're not going to put it, then you're not going to excel on it. It's probably low, right? That's my first thought. It may not be true. Maybe it's because they're scared that they're actually offering more and they don't want to unrest the employees. But that negativity bias in me says it's probably low. I think the second thing is, and you mentioned that people often haven't had that conversation until their first review. I think there's a fear, isn't there, of talking about pay. But what we've really learned through the mental health conversation is actually a willingness to show vulnerability also builds trust. The willingness to talk about having those difficult conversations builds trust with your line manager, builds trust with what you're doing. And if we're able to bring the pay conversation into an ordinary conversation where it is actually readily received, where it's expected, where it's normalized to a certain degree, as you say, demystify, I think was the word you used, actually it stops people feeling so vulnerable about it. And if we can remove the vulnerability, then as you say, it really does build trust as well. I think we're probably a little way to go yet until that becomes a normal conversation outside of a review. But I think these are probably the first steps towards achieving it. I wondered, Sally, if you could share some examples then of clients who have implemented pay equity and pay transparency effectively, because this is a lot of the work that you do. It's an area you're very passionate about. So it'd be great to get some real case studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, a couple of things about pay equity. One is that it takes way longer than you want it to if you're going to do it well. So they're like, okay, we're going to do pay equity, and in 3 months, it's all going to be solved. And I'm like, well, I hate to tell you, that's not gonna happen. So, something to think about, the most successful projects I've had with clients are the ones that are like, okay, we're really going to dig deep into this, right? We're really going to do this well. And one of the reasons it takes a while is because you are getting those rounds of employee feedback, right? And you're starting to have the strategic conversations. And,
that's again, kind of pay, DEI, isn't it? If we tick box it and we try and rush DEI, it doesn't work. You've got to really take that strategic long-term view if you want consistent change to occur over the longer term. Sorry to interrupt, but I was just thinking there, it's, we need to view that with the same lens.
100%. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I tell people all the time, pay equity is a systemic intervention for DEI, if you're going to look at it. So a lot of people, in the DEI space will go into education, awareness, into, practices. But if you want to take it systemically, pay equity is one of your pathways, right? Because you are starting to really look at the things that drive diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, in your workplace through pay. Because once you start looking at pay, it's like, I tell people, it's like a tightly woven sweater. You start pulling that one string and things start falling apart, because pay is connected to so much in organizations. So, just thinking about case studies, had an organization and I work with a lot of nonprofit organizations in the US, not limited to, but a lot, where they were really just looking at, okay, actually, I'm glad you brought up DEI, because they had just done a DEI assessment. And at the same time, they were like, we need to look at pay equity. And so what was interesting is when we did their pay equity assessment, the things that kind of came out of that lined up almost perfectly with their DEI feedback. So we were like, oh, pay is definitely, this pay equity work is going to do well. So we went through a series where we benchmarked all their salaries. And this was a really great conversation because this is a group that was looking to grow in the space. And so in the past, they had used like reports, kind of compensation reports to determine their salaries. And we talked about why, you need to include more data than that, right? Is you want live data. You want, if you're, a $10 million organization and you want to be a $20 million organization, then you probably need to benchmark $20 million organization jobs, right? So we were able to have a lot of strategic conversations about that, and then went and did employee feedback. And it was interesting in that one, like, we got great employee feedback, but it also uncovered like something that happened in the organization like 4 years prior, where it was like a big layoff and people felt unresolved about that. So they ended up doing work around that, in the middle of, the pay equity. And so then, as we went through that process and they determined they couldn't get everybody up in the first year. It's probably going to be a 3-year process. So we sat down and worked on forecasting, the financial forecasting around that, of like, okay, what can you do now? And let's go from there and see how that goes. So that's kind of, a longer term project. There's some groups where I just do, for instance, a pay equity assessment with them. And sometimes the first step with clients is like, they're like, we don't get any employee feedback at all. And I'm like, okay, well, let's start there. That might be your first intervention, right? Is if you have no way of getting employee feedback, and of course, you can pay me to come in and do that, but like a sustainable system for you, do you need to do an annual survey, a pulse? Are you doing exit interviews? Things like that. So sometimes it ends up being that's where we've got to start the work before we can get to some of the other stuff to do the pay equity work well.
No, I think that's really, you raised some interesting points. I've got my brain racing, because in the UK, you mentioned right at the start of the show that we've got gender pay gap reporting here. But actually, with a lot of the companies that are looking at gender pay gap reporting, it highlights other DEI issues. You start to identify we've got an ethnicity pay gap issue here. Now, that's not legislation yet. I suspect it will be at some point. We need to start looking at that in more detail. I think actually we've got a disability pay gap here. It's not just about gender anymore. We're talking about a broader conversation, because the gender is just one element of DEI. And yes, we absolutely need to close that gap as quickly as possible. But I think sometimes when we close that gap, we spot another hole. It's like trying to plug all the holes of a sinking ship. There's no point getting gender pay gap right if your ethnicity pay gap reporting is completely out and you've got other disparities. I think taking a holistic approach to pay equity can allow you to get ahead of other firms early on. Certainly in the UK, if ethnicity pay gap reporting comes in, if disability pay gap reporting comes in later on, but you get pay equity right now, then you're going to find that process way easier in the future. And it's going to be, as you say, that transparent, that trust building piece is going to be way ahead of your competitors in relation to building that trust, building that transparency. Now, I know you haven't got that yet in the US, but it seems to me that this is going to come at some point because employees are demanding it. And if at the moment employees have the voice, we saw that with the Great Resignation in just 2 years ago, right? It's coming because people want to have more transparent information at their fingertips to make more conscious decisions about where they spend their time working. I would love to get your view on some of those other elements, because in the future, I suspect in the work that you do, you might have to start doing more analysis around some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, and that's part of our pay equity assessment that we do. But, think even like, let's just say gender. I find a lot of organizations only have 2 gender options, right, in their pay data. So then we start having a conversation about that, part of our pay equity assessment was we'll do intersectional identities, right? So we'll layer on all the things we're looking at, and we'll be like, well, this, I look at it just from like a salary perspective, but I'll be like, I'll be able to kind of pull it out and be like, this person's probably going to leave soon. They're like, oh my God, this person's been really unhappy. I'm like, yeah, because they're experiencing the most burden in their pay structure. But, I think another piece of that is really, so the gender pay gap, piece, to your point, you can do the reporting, but like the biggest things you can bring those pay, obviously there needs to, the gap needs to be closed, but like the 2 biggest things to close the gender pay gap just for females are looking at the broken rung and the glass cliff, which is broken rung is the first opportunity to supervise other people, and the glass cliff is putting people in C-suite positions that are doomed to fail. And so those are not like that's not like a pay equity issue, but those are practices that are going to close your gender pay gaps, right? And so that's, like I said, that's why when you start looking at pay equity, it's like things just start falling out because you're like, oh my gosh, we got to do this. Yeah, I mean, it's just like peeling an onion, right? And I tell people, don't get distracted, like make a list of all the other things you got to do. And keep going on the pay equity work, but it will bring out a lot of strategic stuff that's just only going to strengthen your HR platform and, again, build trust, right? Like to have a conversation with an employee being like, hey, we've gone through this process. This is why we pay what we do. We can't compete against, in the United States, it would be like Amazon or Meta or Verizon, but this is what we can offer you. And we can show you clearly how you're going to progress here and clearly, what development looks like and things like that. And if you're paying at the cost of living or higher, that person may choose you over somebody who pays them more because they trust you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And actually, I also wanted to highlight here that you and I were talking about opening that Pandora's box, and that might make people fearful about diving in, but potential lives on the other side of fear. And if we get that right, if we're able to dive into it, it pays dividends in the longer term, because that transparency is what employees are looking for. It'll help you to, and I know from the work that I do, it'll help you recruit better talent faster. It'll help you to retain that talent. So yes, sometimes you have to do some of that heavy lifting, but longer term, it will pay dividends if you get it right now. And you shouldn't be fearful of what's in that Pandora's box, because actually it means we're not addressing things we probably know are systemically wrong in our system and we're afraid to look at it. But these things have a way of finding their way out. And I think sometimes there's nothing wrong with just addressing it. Even those companies that maybe have a gender pay gap in the UK, the companies that have been the most upfront about it and saying, look, we know there's a problem. We're doing our best now to try and rectify it. And then just admitting there's an issue actually builds a lot more trust and transparency with employees, knowing that they're working towards something, than hiding it altogether. So I think you raised some really, really interesting points. I know it's an area that you're really, really passionate about. You've got a book coming out as well called The Pay Equity Guide for Nonprofit Organizations. So I'd love to get your thoughts based on, well, maybe just what I just mentioned about not being fearful of that Pandora's box, but also talking a little bit about your book as well.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I talk about that exact thing in the book, is that when people get on this I call it a pay equity journey, right? Is like you start kind of digging into the data and you're like, oh no, we got a lot of issues, right? Like this is not good. And I deal with a lot of groups who will be like, the time between them discovering the issues and then implementation can be, 6 to 8 months sometimes. And so those HR people are like, I know we're not doing this right. I know we're not doing this right. And I'm like, it's okay. We're going to fix it in the end. So the Pay Equity Guide for Nonprofit Organizations is releasing June 2024. I'm super excited about it. And it's just really, it's a guidebook for people for implementing pay equity. While the focus is US-based nonprofits, I will say anybody can read this book and really, kind of go through the 4 phases I talked about. And there's, I go through the history of pay equity, kind of the elements around pay equity. I talk about the gender pay gap, race and ethnicity pay gap, inclusive practices for caregivers, and then go through those 4 phases and then do some lessons learned. And at the end, there is a small group guide that people can use at their organization to basically walk through the practice if they want to do it on their own, which is possible. And I also have a free website portal that's for Pay Equity Collective for people to get resources to do the pay equity work on their own. So I'm really excited about this book because I want to be able to put this work into the hands of people, to do it. And I don't want it to be limited to just hiring a consultant. I want people to be able to start having these conversations about pay equity and start the work now.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm so glad that you've taken the time to use all of your expertise and case studies and work in this subject and put it into a guide people can utilize. Of course, I will try and put a link in the show notes for those that are interested in grabbing a copy. Check the show notes of the show and you should be able to get a copy very, very easily. We're going to open the HR L&D Vault. These are 3 short, sharp questions for you, Sally. Going to keep you on your toes. If you could give one piece of universal advice, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, that's such an open-ended question. I will say, this is what I joke with people, what I want on my gravestone. It's just be kind. Be known for your kindness.
We've had that before, and I can see why. It's a great response, and it's hard, it's hard to challenge it, right? Be more kind. Love that. Number 2, reflecting on your career so far, what advice would you give to those just beginning their career journey in this new world of work?
Ooh, I would say be willing to let go of your expectations. And I say that in, like, for instance, whenever I first started off, I thought, coming out of college, I'm going to get this amazing job and blah, blah, blah. It didn't quite go that way, but I'm so glad the path I was able to take, because I was able to get much more grounding in the framework of the organization before I got into, like, my dream HR job. So I think letting go of expectations and willing to be humble are really important as you're starting out in your career.
Brilliant advice. Life is colorful. We never know what's ahead of ourselves. Let's take, see what comes. So really good advice. And last but not least, from your experience, what common traits or behavior have you observed in all of the great leaders or effective leaders that you've worked with?
Oh my gosh, these are such great questions. To limit it to just a few, I think one thing that really stands out to me, I read a lot of biographies, and especially of kind of leaders and things like that. And what stands out to me is that a lot of the most successful people had really good care practices for themselves and for their teams. So, for instance, John D. Rockefeller, controversial figure in the U.S., but he only worked like 4 hours a day. And then would spend the afternoon walking and being outside and really thinking. And so just finished the Elon Musk biography. I don't know if he would be known for care practices, but, just it's interesting for me to study leaders and try to kind of pull out, like, what is it, the people who have, like, really that are thought leaders, to think about how do they create spaces where they can think about these things, because so often we're connected. So I think having a really good care practice around being disconnected at times and being really strong in relationship will actually make you more productive.
Yeah, for sure. This is one of my favorite analogies in the world, is the idea that of a Formula One race. I'm going to take this in here now. So you can have the fastest car, the most aerodynamic machine ever created, and the best driver. But if you don't go into a pit stop, chances are you don't finish the race. It's won and lost in the pit stop. The time we take to think about how can we make improvements, what tires need changing, what do we need to do. If you decide to skip that moment in the race, certainly if for those that listen to or watch F1, you're not going to finish no matter how good your car is. So we need to create more space for ourselves. We need to make more space for recovery, which is crazy because in the world of sport, which I'm really passionate about anyway, like, recovery is really, really important, and athletes will prioritize that. But in the world of work and leadership, people don't. They're just pedal to the metal all the time and don't find that space to create that space to recover. So that's how I interpreted the response anyway, and it spoke to me in that way. So really glad I asked the question. But for those that want to find out more, where can we direct our listeners to today, Sally?
Yeah, definitely come to my website, loftispartners.com. You'll find all the things you need. That's where the Pay Equity Collective is. But you can find me on LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and I have a newsletter on LinkedIn that I publish monthly called the Fully Human Resources Newsletter, where I try to really kind of talk about a lot of, prioritizing humanity and resourcing them in the workplace. So would love for you to find me there.
Fantastic. Well, I'll try and include as many of those links as I can in the show notes. For those that are interested, please do click through to the show notes of today's episode, and you'll find all those links, including the LinkedIn profile, hopefully a link to the book, and of course, the loftispartners.com as well. Of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please do remember to subscribe to the show. Please do review it if you get a moment, and please do share it with all of your colleagues and friends. And of course, if you do need support recruiting top HR talent, we talked a little bit about the cost of getting a poor hire wrong. It can be really expensive. We're really passionate here at JGA Recruitment about getting the right talent in first time. We take a painstakingly detailed approach to doing that. We help build your EVPs so that you do get it right first time. So do get in touch with either myself or my colleagues at jgarecruitment.com. And just leaves me to say a huge thank you today for joining me on the HR L&D podcast, Sally Loftis, for talking about pay equity, for bringing it into the world of HR today so the listeners can really take away with some actionable steps to understanding and really just giving a mouthpiece and amplifying what is a really, really important subject for so many reasons, not just because it's about pay, transparency and trust, but also because it has such a linchpinning role in relation to, getting DEI right and all the other bits and pieces as well. So thank you ever so much for joining me today on the show. Today's episode of the HR L&D podcast is sponsored by Deal, the all-in-one global people platform that simplifies how you manage the entire global team lifecycle. From contractors, direct employees, EOR, and more, you can manage them all in one place with Deal. Hire and onboard talent in over 150 countries in minutes, or run payroll in over 100 countries with just one click. Offer competitive benefits, equipment, and equity from a single dashboard. Even customize career roadmaps, performance assessments, and more for your team through Deal's suite of AI-powered learning and development tools. So no matter your global business goals, Deal's team of over 200 legal experts keeps you compliant with local laws every step of the way. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, Deal is built to meet your unique global HR needs. Ready to transform your global HR? Click the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deal today. That's DEEL.